There is a story you have known your whole life. You may have first encountered it in a house of worship, in a classroom, or from someone who read it to you as a child. But wherever you heard it, you were probably not told what it actually says. You were given the summary: 2 brothers, 1 murder, 1 cautionary note about jealousy. And then it was filed away, and the conversation moved on. That summary is not wrong. It is simply too small for what is there. The story of Cain and Abel is 4 verses long in its essential moment. A man brings an offering, his brother brings an offering, one is accepted, one is not, and then a man is dead. Genesis moves through the first murder in human history with the economy of a police report. No dramatic build-up, no interior monologue, no explanation of why the offerings were judged differently. Just the action, the consequence, and the long aftermath of exile. Ancient texts do not explain. They point. They hand you the outline of something and trust that something inside you will recognize its shape. And the shape of this story, once you stop treating it as a cautionary tale about a man with bad impulses, is the shape of one of the most universal experiences in human life. The experience of bringing your genuine effort into the world and watching it be refused. Of standing beside someone whose very existence seems to confirm your inadequacy. This is not a story about 2 brothers in an ancient field. It is a map of what happens inside a person when they feel rejected without explanation, compared without mercy, and left without recourse. It is the first psychological account in Western literature of how inner darkness, when it is neither examined nor understood, moves through a person and into the world as destruction. It is a story about envy's true structure, about the fall of the face, about the crouching thing at the door. Today, we are going to read it slowly, all the way down. We are going to sit with the offering and the silence, with rejection and what it does inside, with envy's real nature, which is darker and more precise than most people realize. Something in what follows may feel familiar. Good. That is the point. The story begins not with murder, but with sincerity. Cain is a farmer, a tiller of the ground. Abel is a shepherd. Each brings an offering to God. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, the finest of what he has. Cain brings an offering from the fruit of the ground, and God looks with favor on Abel's offering. On Cain's, he does not. The text gives no explanation. Hold that. This is not an oversight. It is the center of the story's psychology. The author of Genesis does not tell us why God preferred Abel's offering. There is no stated criterion, no announced standard, no warning that one kind of gift would be acceptable and the other would not. The ground rules were never communicated, and the verdict was delivered anyway. Every serious reader of this passage has struggled with that silence. The rabbinical tradition worked hard to fill it. Some commentators argued that Cain had offered inferior grain, the leftovers of the harvest, rather than the finest of the first fruits. Others argued that the problem was not the quality of the offering, but the disposition of the offerer. Rashi, the great medieval rabbi, read Cain's act of bringing as something performed out of obligation rather than love. Abel, he suggested, came with an open heart. Cain came because it was required of him. There is another tradition worth knowing here. The Gnostic reading of this story runs nearly opposite to the conventional one. In certain Gnostic texts, the God who rejected Cain's offering is not the highest divine principle but the demiurge, a lesser deity who governs the material world with arbitrary authority. In this reading, Cain's refusal to simply accept that an arbitrary verdict carries a hidden dignity. He is the one who questions. He is the one who cannot submit to an injustice merely because it descends from a position of power. His rage, in this interpretation, is not the rage of a criminal. It is the rage of a person who has been refused without reason and cannot pretend otherwise. You do not have to be a Gnostic to find that reading useful. It points to something the conventional interpretation often overlooks: the possibility that Cain's anger was not entirely without foundation. That feeling refused without explanation is not simply a test of humility to be passed quietly and moved beyond. It is a wound that deserves acknowledgement before it can be addressed. But here is where both readings converge. Regardless of why the offering was refused, what happens next inside Cain is not principled resistance. It is collapsing. Picture that moment. A man who came to this place with something he made from a season of labor, something that cost him the sweat of his hands and the care of a farmer for his ground, standing there with his offering still before him, while his brother's smoke rises and his own remains where he left it. The text says his face fell. In Hebrew, the word used, nafal, means to drop, to fall, to be brought low. It is the word used for bodies falling in battle and for walls falling under siege. His countenance did not dim or cloud. It fell, the way a structure falls when the foundation beneath it is suddenly gone. The body registered that verdict before the mind had words for it. The face dropped, and everything that followed was born in that single involuntary fall. What happens inside a person when they are rejected without explanation? The first response, in almost every case, is not anger. Anger comes later. What arrives first is confusion, followed rapidly by the mind's attempt to restore order. The human mind has a deep, structural aversion to arbitrariness. It cannot rest on the idea that something happened for no reason. And so, when rejection arrives without explanation, the mind begins to generate its own theory of cause. The theory it produces, with remarkable consistency, is this: I am the reason. This is worth understanding carefully, because it looks like self-blame, but it is something more complex. When the mind tells a rejected person that they caused their own exclusion, it is not simply being cruel to them. It is offering them something they desperately need in that moment: a sense of agency. If I caused this, then I am not powerless. If there is something I did or failed to do that produced this verdict, then, in principle, I can do it differently. The story of self-blame, as painful as it is, restores to the rejected person the feeling that the world is legible, that it obeys rules, that they have some purchase on their own fate. But the story has a cost that becomes visible only later. Once the mind accepts the idea that it is the reason for its own rejection, it begins to scan the environment for confirmation. It begins to compare, and in Cain's case, the comparison is inescapable. The evidence of his supposed failure is standing right beside him, living and breathing, tending his flocks in the favor of the same God who refused Cain's grain. Abel did nothing wrong. The text records nothing malicious in Abel's behavior toward his brother. He brought his offering. It was accepted. That is the entirety of what Abel did. But here is where the psychology of rejection does its most damaging work. It does not need an active aggressor to produce a wound. All it needs is proximity. All it needs is someone whose success can be read in the rejected person's mind as confirmation of their failure. Cain does not hate Abel in the simple, hot way that people hate someone who has actively hurt them. What he experiences is something more disorienting. He hates the gap. He hates the distance between what Abel received and what he lacks, and because Abel is the living embodiment of that gap, the feeling settles on Abel. Not because Abel created the distance, because Abel is standing inside it, on the favored side, and Cain cannot look at him without feeling the verdict repeated. This is the mechanism that drives the murder, not Abel himself, not anything Abel said or did. What Cain cannot bear is not his brother's existence, but the meaning he has assigned to it. Abel's smoke, rising every time they are in the same field, is a judgment rendered over and over in smoke. Friedrich Nietzsche called this dynamic ressentiment, a French term he used deliberately for a concept that he believed had no adequate German equivalent. Resentment is the rage of a person who feels powerless, directed at a target who did not cause that powerlessness, but embodies it. The resentment cannot reach its actual source, so it redirects toward the nearest available symbol of what has been lost. Abel was not Cain's oppressor. Abel was Cain's mirror, and the mirror had to go. Most people confuse envy with jealousy, and the confusion matters more than it might appear. Jealousy is the fear of losing what you already have to a rival. It is essentially defensive. Envy is something structurally different. Envy is the pain caused by another person's advantage, combined with the wish that they did not have it. Not the wish that you had it too, the wish that they didn't. This is the structural darkness at the heart of envy that popular understanding consistently misses. Envy is not fundamentally acquisitive, it is destructive. The envious person does not dream primarily of standing beside the favored one as an equal. They dream of the favored one's fall. This is what the medieval theologians who placed envy among the 7 deadly sins understood with such uncomfortable clarity. Thomas Aquinas described it as tristia de bono alieno, sadness at another's good, not a desire gone wrong, not a hunger misdirected, sadness, a grief response to something that, by any rational measure, should have no effect on the grieving person at all. Aquinas noticed something else about envy that distinguishes it from every other entry on the classical list. It offers its bearer no pleasure. The miser enjoys the gold. The glutton enjoys the feast. The proud person enjoys the reflection they see in other people's deference. Even anger, at its moment of expression, carries a certain dark release. But envy gives nothing back. The envious person is miserable without respite, and the source of that misery is the simple, blameless fact of another's flourishing. There is no satisfaction in it. There is only pain at the other person's good and the wish to see it ended. Schopenhauer, who wrote about envy with characteristic directness, called it the most antisocial of all the passions, not because the envious person necessarily acts on it, but because it poisons the well of human relations at its source. Where genuine love expands when another person flourishes, envy contracts. Where compassion finds the other's good a reason for joy, envy finds it a reason for grief. The envious person cannot inhabit a community, because a genuine community requires the capacity to be glad for what others have. Envy forecloses that capacity entirely. Every friendship, every collaboration, every shared endeavor becomes contaminated by the running comparison. Why does this happen? Because the comparison was made before the envy arrived. Envy is not a response to what the other person has. It is a response to the gap between what they have and what the envious person believes they deserve. Cain does not look at Abel's flock and think, "I want a flock too." He looks at Abel's accepted offering and thinks, "That acceptance should have been mine." The wound is not about what Abel possesses. It is about what the acceptance of Abel's offering implies about the refusal of Cain's. This is the reading of the story's psychology that surface-level treatments consistently miss. Envy, at its root, is not about things. It is about recognition. It is about the deep human need to have one's offering received, to know that what you brought into the world with care and labor was worth something. When that recognition is given to another and withheld from you, something in the self reads it not as a practical matter of different gifts, but as a judgment of worth, of adequacy, of being itself. Here is the part that is hardest to hold, and the most important. People who carry the wound of rejection do not hate the favored one the way they hate someone who has actively wronged them. They hate them the way a person hates a mirror that insists on showing something they cannot accept. Before the murder happens, something extraordinary occurs. God sees what is building inside Cain, and God speaks. He says, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. 4 sentences, and they are among the most psychologically penetrating lines in any ancient text. Consider what is happening here. God does not explain the rejection. He does not revoke it, soften it, or offer Cain a second attempt with clearer guidelines. He does not apologize for the silence that came before. What he does instead is name exactly what is occurring inside Cain. He sees the fallen face. He sees the kindling rage, and he addresses it directly, not by removing the cause of the pain, but by pointing to the decision that is now in front of Cain. Sin crouching at the door. The image is physical, vivid, a predatory thing waiting at the threshold, not yet inside, not yet in action. The catastrophe has not happened. The murder is still only a possibility, and that possibility is being named, precisely and with urgency, by the one figure in the story who can see it clearly. What makes this moment so striking is that it is not a condemnation, it is an instruction. God is not telling Cain he is bad. He is telling Cain that he is at a decision point. Something is waiting at his door. He has the capacity to govern it. The word used for rule in Hebrew, mashal, is the same word deployed for the governance of a city and the authority of a king over a domain. Cain is being told that the inner territory is his to govern, not easily, not without cost, but governable. Cain does not respond. This silence is the moral center of the story, not the murder, which everyone discusses, the silence that precedes it. Because the murder could not have happened if Cain had found any words at all in that moment. Even if he had said, "I do not know how," even if he had said, "I am angrier than I can manage," even that would have been a reaching toward what was being asked. But there is nothing. The text gives him no words. He simply rises and goes to the field. What does it mean that he could not respond? It means the wound was already too deep for the instruction to reach it. When a person has taken a verdict of rejection and built an entire interior world around its meaning, a 4-sentence address to their capacity for self-governance is not something they can receive. Not because they are wicked, because they are in pain, and pain of sufficient depth does not hear instruction. It hears only confirmation or contradiction of the story it has already constructed about why it hurts. God's question was a genuine invitation, and Cain was already somewhere else, already in the field, already at the place where the logic of the wound had been leading him since the moment his face fell. This is not a story about inevitable evil. It is a story about what happens when pain goes unexamined long enough, when the inner voice that says something is wrong in here is never allowed to find words. When the crouching thing at the door is neither acknowledged nor confronted, it enters. After the murder, something happens that almost no one stops to examine. God does not destroy Cain. He curses him. He exiles him. He tells him that the ground will no longer yield to his farming, that he will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And Cain, who has just killed his brother, responds with what sounds at first like self-pity. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Whoever finds me will kill me." Most readers move past this quickly. They are not interested in Cain's fear because he has just killed, but pay attention to what God does next. He places a mark on Cain. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance. The killer is protected. The wanderer carries a mark that guarantees his survival. Why? The rabbinical tradition spent centuries on that question. What is the mark? A letter on the forehead, some said. A horn, suggested others. A dog given as a companion to protect him in the wilderness, proposed still others. The traditions diverge on what the mark was, but they agree on its function. It preserved him, not for comfort, for continuation. Here is the esoteric reading that carries the most weight. The mark is not a brand of shame placed on a criminal. It is a seal of preservation placed on someone who still has unfinished work to do. Cain committed the first murder, but Cain had not yet understood what drove him to it. The exile is not a death sentence softened by mercy. It is an assignment, a forced confrontation with the interior that the settled life of farming and offering could never have produced. Carl Jung, who understood the narrative function of the shadow better than almost any modern thinker, described the necessary confrontation with the unconscious as a descent. You cannot integrate what you have not faced. You cannot face what you have not admitted is there. The shadow is not destroyed by the conscious self. It is acknowledged, engaged, and gradually brought into relationship with the whole person. Cain, in this reading, is not condemned to wander because God is punishing him. He is sent into the territory where the confrontation he refused to have before the murder must now take place, without the easy comforts of home, without the brother whose accepted smoke confirmed his deepest fear about himself, the wandering and the question of what a person does with the worst in themselves when there is nowhere left to redirect it. This understanding of exile runs through multiple inner traditions. The Sufi concept of longing that arises from separation as the beginning of the path toward union, the Kabbalistic idea of scattered sparks that must be gathered before restoration is possible. Exile, in these traditions, is not the opposite of inner development, it is the crucible of it. The wandering removes the substitutes. You cannot rebuild the altar in the land of Nod. You can only build yourself. The mark of Cain is a guarantee that the wandering will last long enough for the work to happen. It is protection for a process, not mercy for a criminal, and that changes everything about what the story is asking of the one who reads it. Here is where the story stops being ancient and starts being uncomfortable. Every person carries both brothers. This is not a metaphor offered for consolation. It is the literal structure of what the narrative describes. The Abel in you is the part that offers sincerely, that works with genuine care and finds itself recognized. The part that has known what it is to be seen, to have its effort received, to belong to a world that finds you adequate. The Cain in you is the part that offered something equally real and was refused, and has not forgotten, and is still carrying the falling face somewhere below the surface of your ordinary life. You know the Abel in you. Most people identify with it readily. It is the self they lead with in public, the self they protect, the self they prefer to believe is the whole of who they are. But Cain does not disappear because it is ignored. It goes underground, and what goes underground does not cease to operate. It shapes choices and reactions and relationships in ways the conscious self does not take credit for and often cannot explain. Where did your inner Cain form? Not in an ancient field, in a moment. You probably remember more clearly than you admit. Maybe it was a parent who seemed to favor a sibling, not through deliberate cruelty, but through the 1,000 invisible preferences that accumulate into a pattern a child reads long before they have language for it. Maybe it was a school where certain students were celebrated and you were not. Maybe it was a workplace where you labored without acknowledgement while someone beside you received the recognition you had been waiting for. Maybe it was a relationship in which you gave everything and watched, at the end of it, as someone else was chosen. The circumstances differ. The wound has the same structure. Modern social media is the field where this dynamic plays out at a civilizational scale. Every post is an offering. Every metric of engagement is a verdict. Every person who watches their careful work receives silence while something effortless is produced by someone else draws thousands of responses, standing at that altar, watching smoke that is not theirs rise. The comparison is built into the architecture of the platform. It makes the gap visible on every screen, every hour, without mercy and without explanation. The altar is open around the clock, The unexamined inner Cain does not produce physical violence in most cases. It produces something quieter and almost as damaging: resentment that poisons the air of every relationship it enters. Withdrawal from genuine effort because the risk of offering and being refused again is too great. Cynicism dressed as discernment. Contempt for people who are recognized is presented as a critical analysis of their work. The inner Cain is creative in its destructiveness. But here is what changes everything about how we have to approach this. The inner Cain is not the enemy. He is the wounded one. He is the part of you that once wanted something deeply and was told, in some direct or indirect way, that what it brought was not enough, that you were not enough. And he is still there, still at the altar, still carrying the offering no one received, still waiting for someone to return and look at what he brought with honest eyes. After the murder, God asks Cain where his brother is, and Cain responds with a question that has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of Western civilization. Am I my brother's keeper? Most people read this as a deflection, a guilty man attempting to redirect the inquiry, and on the surface, that is exactly what it is. But beneath the deflection, there is a real question, and it is not only Cain's. It is a question that every person who has felt the gap between themselves and a favored other has asked in some form. It is the question that envy, when it has gone deep enough, finally articulates out loud. What the question tries to do is dissolve the relationship. Before the murder, there was a bond. Two brothers, two children of the same parents, sharing the same world and the same altar. That bond is what made the envy possible. You cannot envy a stranger the way you envy a brother. The intimacy of the relationship is what gives the gap its particular savagery. The more connected you are to someone, the more their advantage cuts. And so when Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" he is not simply lying about Abel's location. He is attempting to retroactively dissolve the very connection that made the wound possible. If I had no responsibility for him, then his favor was no concern of mine. If his goods were nothing to me, then his smoke rising could not have diminished me. The murder was not a failure of brotherhood in this reconstruction, because there was no brotherhood to fail. God does not engage the argument. He says, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Abel is gone, but the evidence of what was done to him speaks. The violence writes itself into the ground. It remains audible. This is one of the moral claims the text makes with greatest force, that the destruction of a person who stood too close to your wound is not an erasure, it is an inscription. The moral teaching at the center of this exchange is not one that the story simplifies into a comfortable conclusion. You are your brother's keeper. That is what the text implies. But the implication carries a weight that goes beyond the ethical. It points to the very root of what made the murder possible. Cain could not be Abel's keeper because he could not bear Abel's goodness. He had not yet learned, and the wound had made it impossible to learn what may be the hardest truth this story contains, that another person's favor is not your condemnation. Consider what this means for the person standing at the altar with unaccepted grain. The smoke rising from your brother's altar does not mean yours was refused because you are unworthy. You do not become less when another becomes more. Acceptance and refusal are not always the precise moral measurements. They feel like when the face is falling and the field is empty and the silence is total. But you cannot learn this by deciding to believe it. You can only learn it by sitting with the wound long enough to understand where it actually lives and what it has been doing there all this time. Here is what I want to leave with you. You have been living with this story your whole life. Not the Genesis version, your version. The particular moment or series of moments in which you brought something genuine to the altar of your life and it was not received. When your smoke did not rise and someone nearby had theirs accepted, your face fell. You filed it away under a category called moving on, which was not yet examined. That experience is not ancient history. It is not resolved by the passage of time. It lives in the part of you that tenses when a colleague receives recognition you thought you had earned, in the part that cannot look at certain people's lives without feeling the verdict delivered all over again, in the part that sometimes, in moments of quiet honesty, asks the question Cain asked in his most collapsed hour, "Why not me?" The tradition does not answer that question directly. What it does instead is describe a process. A mark is placed, a wandering begins, and the wandering is not the punishment. It is the shape that an unfinished inner confrontation takes when the settled life can no longer contain it. You have been marked by what happened to you. The question the story is actually asking is not whether the mark is there, it is whether you carry it as a shame or as something more useful. A shame is something you hide, a map is something you read, and the mark, in its deepest reading, is a map of the territory you have not yet traveled, the territory where the wound lives, where the inner Cain is still standing at his altar, still waiting for an explanation that will never come in the form he wants it, where the question, "Why not me?" finally becomes a different question. Not, "Why was I refused?" but, "What have I done with the refusal?" That is what this story is actually asking, not of Cain in an ancient field, of you, now, in whatever field you are standing in, when you allow yourself to be honest about where the smoke is not rising. The wandering is not the punishment, it is the path, and it begins the moment you stop standing outside what happened to you and start going in.